and maybe throughout the time. But so hi everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. This is YouthServe NYC's ninth speaker. And just to remind everyone, YouthServe NYC is a service initiative founded and run by young people who want to become more involved in the work of rebuilding New York City in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. YouthServe NYC is a way to engage peers in service and in social justice. So today we are so happy and fortunate to welcome Tim Campbell, who is the Deputy Executive Director for Programs at Coalition for the Homeless. Founded in 1981, Coalition for the Homeless has created a variety of programs and implemented a number of strategies to fight and help to end mass homelessness in New York City. So thank you so much again for joining us today. We are so excited and fortunate to hear about your work at Coalition for the Homeless and anything else you'd like to share. And just to remind everyone, later when we do questions, if you have any, you can just type them in the Q&A function and I will read them aloud. So over to you and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor. Thank you really so much for having us, having me. That was a great introduction. I'll just say it's an honor to be here with YouthServe NYC. I think young people have really led the way in the past year through very difficult times. And with both their energy and activism, and I think a group like this continuing that energy really is both inspiring and gives a lot of hope. And to be clear, at this point in my life, I consider anyone under the age of 40 to be a young person. So that's a wide group, but I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all. So there was actually a fairly timely piece in the New York Times just yet last night that was an editorial called "How Many Americans Are Homeless?" And it said no one knows. I think it was a mostly good piece, which I don't always feel about articles that are written about homelessness. But in this editorial, it highlighted that the annual federal count of homeless individuals was 568,000 people in 2019. The problem, as is pointed out, is that they use a very limited definition of homelessness, and that the count is deeply flawed. So it doesn't count people for example, in New York City, who might be in alleys or staying on rooftops or in illegal dwellings or even in the subways necessarily. Nationally, it doesn't count people in campgrounds or in hotels that aren't already identified as shelters, or families that are doubled up with other people. So it's very narrow definition. It also happens on one cold night in January. So and the idea is that if you're homeless on that night, then you're homeless all the time. And if you're not homeless, you're not on the street that night, then you're not homeless. And that's really a misunderstanding about how homelessness often works for individuals. But the other statistic that was presented is that in 2017, the last year they had the school district data available, the country counted 1.35 million homeless students. So that used a broader definition, one that does include families that are doubled up. But again, that was just students. So it doesn't include children who aren't school age. It doesn't include parents. It doesn't include individuals who may not be part of those families. And it was more than twice the number of the homeless count. So one of the primary points of the article is that the problem is very big, and we need to know how big it is in order to address it. But here in New York City, we do have a right to shelter, and that is really actually how the coalition got started. The founders of the coalition actually brought a lawsuit on behalf of a gentleman named Robert Callahan, who was on the streets, living on the streets in New York City. And through that litigation, and based on the state constitution, they're able to establish a legal right to shelter here in New York City and New York State, really. And so that right to shelter allows us to know a lot about what the problem looks like here in New York City, because there's a shelter system, and we have some it's much easier to have basic facts when you have a shelter system in place. So and a lot of these facts are available on our website, coalitionforhomeless.org, but I'll just give you some of them right now. The last month that we have the data available is November 2020. And at that point, there were 57,016 homeless people, including 18,368 children sleeping in the shelter system each night. And that also included an all-time record of 20,515 single adults So that for single adults, the highest number that it's ever been since they've been reporting those statistics. Overall, the number is historically very high. If you look at the charts, going back to about 2008, 2009, it's almost a steady climb. It looks like a mountain in terms of the homeless population just going up. It's plateaued a little bit in the last few years, and actually it's come down slightly overall in terms of the family numbers, because there's an eviction moratorium right now related to the pandemic. But it's still at close to historic highs since they've been keeping those statistics at all. And over the course of a year, there's nearly 123,000 different homeless men, women, and children who sleep in the New York City shelter system. And that includes over 39,000 homeless children. So it's not necessarily what people think about when they think about homelessness, but it really has a lot to do with the families, and the lack of affordable housing is the primary driver for homelessness in New York City, and really in many major cities across the country. These are other facts that are related to that. The research shows that surveys from homeless families who report on what triggered their homelessness, the primary reasons are eviction, doubled up or severely overcrowded housing, domestic violence, job loss, and hazardous housing conditions. So this is a little bit different than some of the circumstances for single adults. Single adults do tend to have higher rates of mental illness and other severe health problems. So and that's certainly not across the board, but that is, but if you're looking at the entire population, those are things to consider when you're looking at what solutions might apply best. And all of the numbers I'm presenting about homelessness in New York City do not include people who are residing on the streets of New York. So that unsheltered population, we really don't have an accurate count on. The city puts out a number each year, but again, that goes back to the original point that count is just simply not accurate. So in addition to the 57,000 people who are in the shelter system, you also have thousands more who are unsheltered on the streets of New York. The last fact I would say is that among Black and Latinx New Yorkers, they are disproportionately affected by homelessness. So this is very much a social justice issue. If we have these nice T-shirts for staff and sweatshirts at the coalition for folks who say housing is a human right, and it very much is a human right. Unfortunately, it is not something that is available in that way to folks. We have a legal right to shelter right now in New York, but we very much need to expand upon that. And I think that's the part of the New York Times editorial that was largely missing. That yes, we do need to know what the numbers really are, but we also know that the numbers are so significant, and this is such an enormous problem right now, and its injustice really should not be allowed to continue here in our country. We have, from a federal level, really disinvested in affordable housing and in housing in general. Really since the Reagan years, when housing budgets were cut so significantly. And there needs to be a massive effort to address the woeful lack of affordable housing, especially in cities like New York. And the pandemic may actually present an opportunity to do that. There's, in terms of vacancy rates, space and hotels that could be converted, there are some opportunities there. I think the other thing that has come to light a little bit more are, because of the pandemic, are some of the longstanding injustices and gross disparities that have only been exacerbated by COVID-19. So if there's one thing I would hope that people can take away from all the information I'm sort of spewing out at you at this point, is that homelessness is not a failure on the part of the person who has no home, but it is an absolute failure of our society, that we have numbers in the tens of thousands here in New York City who don't have homes at historic rates, and across the country. And it's also worth me stressing that losing a home is a terribly traumatic event for an individual or family. The most panicked and terrified calls we get here at the Coalition for the Homeless are people who are actually at risk of losing their homes, who are in the eviction process. They come into our eviction prevention program, and those calls are from people who are obviously just traumatized by the idea of losing the space and all the things you take for granted. Whether it's your the comfort of your bedroom and your bed and your own bathroom and your kitchen where you can go to and get the food you want to get and when you want to get it. A lot of these things do not exist in the shelter system and the way that we're used to, and obviously is not where anyone wants to be. And so going through that process can be awful. I would say also, too often our systems re-traumatize people who are traumatized by that loss of a home already. And although there is a right to shelter in New York City, families actually have to apply for shelter and prove that they are homeless. And that process can be very difficult. You basically have to show that you're a family, and then you have to provide a 2-year housing history that provides every address that you've stayed at in the past 2 years. And then the city will investigate each one of those addresses, and they'll decide whether or not they think you can go back to one of those addresses. But often families are caught in this catch-22 where the city is saying they think you can go back to an address, and maybe it's your aunt or your cousin or your friend who you're staying on the couch there, with your family, and they say they need the living room back, and I'm sorry, you can't stay here anymore. You're putting my tenancy at risk. That family is now caught between those two things because they're told they can't go back there, but the city's saying you can't get shelter because we think you can go somewhere else. So what that means is the bottom line is that, in November, where we have the last assistance available at the Path, which is the one intake center in all of New York City for families with children, only 26% of families who applied were found eligible for shelter. At the Adult Family Intake Center, where adult families apply for shelter, only 17% of families were found eligible for shelter. It gives you an idea of how hard those rates are at historic lows, which you would hope would be the opposite and during a pandemic like we're in. But also, it's worth saying that 39% of adult families had to apply 6 or more times to be found eligible for shelter. So that provides some idea of how hard the process can be to go through and how dehumanizing that can feel when you're looking for basic help for shelter. So what do we do at the Coalition? We fight for our clients' rights. It's how we started, like I said, and it's what we continue to do in our advocacy department. We have an advocacy department that advocates both at the city and state level. We don't like to sue the city. That's not what we shoot to do. We try to partner with the city and making improvements as much as possible. But we do continue to do that, and we have done that recently when we feel like our clients' rights are not being upheld. And we do that in partnership with the Legal Aid Society, who represents us. We also run programs. So that's my main job at the Coalition, is working with the program directors and the program staff we have, who are excellent. And then we learn from the people we serve, who are really the true experts in all of this, because they're the ones going through the systems firsthand. They know what is working and what is not working. And then we report that back both to the Department of Homeless Services, who, when we're advocating for folks individually, and to our advocacy department as well, when we're seeing trends that are of concern, that are clear evidence that the system is not working the way it's supposed to. Quickly, I let you know that we run 11 programs in all, so that includes our crisis services. Like under normal circumstances, we'll have up to 50 households a day coming into our crisis intervention department here in the office where I am in downtown Manhattan. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it has not been safe to do that for our clients and have people gather in that way. So we've been operating a hotline instead. We also have an eviction prevention program, like I just mentioned earlier, which works to keep people in their homes before they become homeless, so they don't have to go through this process. And we have a client advocacy program, which works with people with disabilities to try and get them benefits and into housing. That's our crisis services. We also have a mobile food program, which goes out every single night of the year and hasn't missed a night for 30 plus years, including during the pandemic, because it operates outside. And so we serve meals to people who are on the streets, and we were able to do that safely. And we serve over 1,000 meals a night. We've actually seen the need increase exponentially there in the past year. We also have a mail program here, so people can come to the coalition, get their mail, use that to access their benefits, and also to correspond with anybody they need to. We have about 1,500 people who use this address as their mailing address. And we have housing programs. So we across 3 different housing programs, we house nearly 120 households, provide permanent housing for them and case management services. And then we have a job training program for homeless and low-income women as well, who are trying to get back into the workforce. And finally, we have our youth services. We talked about there being a lot of homeless children, which is not necessarily what people think of when they think of homelessness, but so we have an after-school program that operates out of 2 Department of Homeless Services shelters that becomes a summer day program in the summertime. And then we also have a sleepaway camp called Camp Homeward Bound that serves, under normal circumstances, over 300 children over the course of the summer. So we're very hopeful we'll be able to do that again this summer, although it probably will be scaled back based on what the circumstances allow for at that point. But going back one last time to that New York Times editorial, I'd say the other important point that is that the somewhat mind-blowing numbers and statistics that were presented can only be an undercount of what the true problem is, of how many people don't have homes in this country. But the point the article makes is that it's also made up of unique individuals and families. And that is very much the case, that each person with their own story. And to that point, I thought it might be more effective to end with a very short video about our Camp Homeward Bound program. The video is admittedly a few years old, and though I love our camp program, the reason I want to show it is not to highlight camp so much, but so you can see the faces of some of the young people who have battled homelessness. They're not necessarily, again, who we think of when we think of a homeless person, but based on the count of homeless children by school districts that I referred to earlier, 1 in 10 New York City school children were homeless at some point in 2019, 1 in 10. So again, the scope of the problem is really mind-boggling in that sense, and what kids go through. So the kids you see in this video that Eleanor is about to show, for it just takes a minute, are remarkable and incredibly resilient. But like all the people we serve, they deserve so much better. So Eleanor, if you don't mind showing that, that'd be great.
Yes, okay. Actually, let me just make sure I have my sound on. Okay, can everyone see that? Can you see that?
Yes.
Can you hear that?
I think what makes Camp Homeward Bound so
And can you hear that as well?
Yes.
Okay, great.
special is that the counselors always care for you and you get to be free and have fun.
Great way to meet new people.
It's lots of fun. You meet counselors from all over the world.
That they just think really cool. Like, they protect us. Like, they really, really protect us.
It gives them a chance to get their childhood back and have fun and be safe all at the same time.
It was me and another counselor speaking to the girl. And she said that she didn't want to be in the dance hall because she didn't know how to dance. And I told her, like, look at me, I can't dance. And I was like, look at how I dance. And I made a couple of funny moves and it made her feel better. And after a while, she was like, well, I do it better than you. And then after we got inside, she got so excited about dancing that she ended up dancing. And I felt like I made a difference, being able to tell her to dance. And she went in and she did what she wanted to do, and she ended up feeling better by the time we left.
Who got that spirit? Yeah, yeah, that's the spirit. Yeah, yeah, let's see it in your head. We love Camp Homeward Bound.
We love CHB.
We love Camp Homeward Bound.
I love all my counselors, but my mom, she missed me, and tomorrow she will see me. She will be proud of me.
Thanks. The little guy at the end always gets me. So.
Okay, so Great, thank you so much. I think we can go to questions now. I see a fair amount of questions in the chat, and I will get to those. And actually, I'll just start reading them right now. So, first question is, what would be the best strategy for the government to stop evictions of families when they fall behind on their rent?
So there are some good resources in place right now for people who fall behind on the rent in New York City. There's something called a one-shot deal that you can get through the Human Resources Administration, and that does allow for some larger grants at times. Our eviction prevention program is also a good example where we get funds from the government, both state funds and federal funds, and from private foundations that allow us to provide grants to people who are at risk of eviction. The primary way that's worked for years and years is that, you know, somebody might have fallen behind because they lost a job, for example, and that would be the sort of most typical scenario. But now they have a new job and they might have missed a few months of rent and they need help getting caught up. So it doesn't make any sense for that person to go through the trauma of losing their home and the costs of entering the shelter. I mean, it costs, you know, over $70,000 to shelter a family for a year in the New York City shelter system. So it makes both financial sense and humane sense to keep that family in their home, and that's exactly how those programs work. I would say that right now, because of the pandemic, there is a tremendous risk. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are in arrears, and the only reason they're not at immediate risk of losing their homes is because of the eviction moratorium, which is keeping folks from being evicted right now. Once that is lifted, though, there's going to need to be enormous influx of assistance. There has been some already allocated for people to get more assistance with their arrears, and it's going to have to be more expansive. And the state is going to be using some federal money to do that, but that is likely only going to be a portion of what's needed, given the scale of the crisis. There's been some estimates of maybe 400,000 households at risk of eviction based on people being arrears in the current climate. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next one, I'll just read it. This person says, I've thought a lot about the prison to shelter pipeline recently, particularly with COVID-19 health-related releases from correctional facilities in New York and around the country. How do you address specific homelessness issues relating to justice-involved individuals?
That is a great question. It's also, and it is something that it has only increased in recent years, where people who are being released from state prison are going straight to shelter. And in some cases, we do hear from our clients who are in shelter and feel like they never left prison because of the conditions in the shelter that they may be placed in, and their experience it feels like it mirrors what they where they were in when they were in prison. So that is also been exacerbated by the fact that there are a number of bureaucratic reasons that people are not getting to be released to places that they do actually have to go. So sometimes somebody has a family member they could be going and living with. The way that the release system works, it can actually take longer to get that address approved than it can take to be approved to go to the shelter system. And so by default, sometimes people are sent to the shelter system. And that is also compounded by the fact that there are sometimes, with respect to parole, it's easier if you know where if you have a group of people at a certain, place, and that, leads to addresses not being approved when they should be approved as well. So it gets a little bit complicated, but that's one of the things that could be improved upon right off the bat. The other thing is that there needs to be more resources, for people who are coming out of prison to be able to be placed into housing, so that process starts in prison and not, you don't have to enter shelter instead of that process beginning there. So.
Great, thank you. Okay, another one. So other than what you said before about not being involved with person, what are other some of the biggest misconceptions about being homeless that you found?
I mean, I think the list goes on and on. I think the myths about homelessness, so most of the times when somebody talks to me about homelessness or is describing a homeless person, they're thinking of somebody who's on the streets. They often describe somebody who has a severe mental health issue and may or may not have challenges with substance use as well. And I would say off the bat that while certainly we serve people who are, we serve a lot of people who are on the streets. We serve a lot of people who have severe mental health issues, some of whom have a substance use issue, and which is very much a medical issue as well, and but not nearly the percentage that is described. Those folks, I think, are some of our most vulnerable clients and absolutely need support and do not get the level of support they need in order to get off the streets. There's not, the primary option that is given to the folks on the streets is the shelter system, and that often has not worked for people. So the rest of the population, the people who live in the shelter system, you could be sitting next to that person on the subway and have no idea that that person is homeless. And that is the majority of the homeless population here in New York City. And that is, it's moms, it's single moms often in the family system, it's children, it's dads with trying to do their best to support their families. And it's, again, that boils down to mainly about the lack of affordable housing here in New York City. So.
Okay, so we have a fair amount more, but I think we just have time for around 2 more maybe.
Okay.
Okay, so someone in the chat says affordable housing would be the best long-term solution to this problem, but there are many obstacles to achieving this goal, not just cost. Does your organization have a strategy to work on this?
Yes, I think there are many different strategies that our advocacy department works with. I think it's a little complicated to go into, at the time we have available. I would say we have pushed for supportive housing. We have pushed for vouchers for our clients, which allow people to rent units with housing subsidy. There is not nearly enough public housing available, and the public housing we have is not taken care of in the way that it needs to be taken care of. But I'd say the key is that there are a number of strategies, and there needs to be more. There needs to be an array of strategies that we're using in order to make sure that we're presenting the right amount of options for folks, depending on the individual circumstances, because it is very much an individual problem.
Great. Okay. So this last one is just, what is your advice to young people like us who want to get involved in more public service work? In your opinion, what are some of the best ways to do this? And just what general advice do you have to people who are very committed to the city and to helping vulnerable New Yorkers?
So we do have some options. It is, I think, volunteering. We talked about this a little bit. It's a little harder in the current environment, unfortunately. Because of the pandemic, it's made volunteer opportunities a little harder to come by. It's harder to have groups. We certainly have had volunteers come out on our food program who are younger, and just the act of going and providing a meal to someone and doing that with some kindness and decency, I think, is something that is incredibly powerful and impactful, and that's the experience of the vast majority of people who've ever volunteered on our food program. So things like that, I think, can be very meaningful. But I think also the activism is something that is really very much needed. I think the energy and the activism that young people brought, to issues like this and to expanding what people think is even possible, and pushing the envelope to let us all know that we can be doing better on behalf of all of our neighbors, and that everybody deserves something as basic as a home, are things that we all can be doing. And there's ways to do that. And if you go to our website, we often have ways to participate in advocacy like that.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much for everyone who attended, and thank you so much for speaking with us. And this was recorded, so there will be a recording posted soon. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thanks for having me. Okay, take care.